She broke the bread in half and slid the plate toward him. The boy didn't speak. He stared at the food like it might vanish if he moved too fast. Dirt on his face, hunger in his eyes. A black woman feeding a white child on land people said was never meant to be hers. Cars slowed, eyes judged. Someone laughed and said she was wasting kindness on the wrong kind of boy. No one defended her. No one stepped in. They thought this moment would be forgotten. They were wrong. Because the silence they chose that day would come back and it would cost them everything. Comment and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe for more powerful stories that demand to be heard. Ruth had lived on that land long before the county started sending letters with official seals and code language. Her days followed a quiet rhythm. She woke before sunrise, pressed her fingers into the soil, and worked until her back reminded her she was no longer young. There was no one else to rely on, no safety net, just routine, discipline, and pride. Ruth Carter didn't ask the town for help because experience had taught her that help always came with conditions. Years earlier, the same land had witnessed a different kind of struggle. One afternoon, a boy appeared near the porch, thin, exhausted, and standing as if he expected to be chased away. Ruth didn't ask where he came from. She noticed the hunger first. She broke bread, placed a plate in front of him, and told him to eat before it got cold. The boy hesitated, then quietly said he would pay her back one day. Ruth waved it off and told him to focus on surviving. Kindness, to her, didn't need a return. That boy was Elijah Thompson, though the town never bothered to learn his name. Neighbors slowed their cars when they saw him on Ruth's porch. Some stared, others whispered. Linda Parker once pulled her curtain shut the moment their eyes met, as if even acknowledging what she saw meant taking a side. In that place, compassion was treated like a mistake, especially when it crossed invisible lines. Time passed, but the environment around Ruth never softened. Inspections became more frequent. Notices arrived without warning. The rules shifted constantly, and they never shifted in her favor. At the county office, her questions were met with tight smiles and vague answers. On paper, everything looked proper. In reality, the pressure felt intentional. Howard Whitman's name appeared again and again on documents that tightened control over her land, each one making it harder for her to breathe. When William Thompson came for Elijah years later, he spoke calmly about opportunity and futures Ruth could never offer. Letting the boy go was the hardest decision she ever made, but she didn't stand in the way. Some doors, she believed, were meant to open, even if it meant being left behind. Now, standing alone on land, everyone insisted she should have sold. Ruth felt the weight of every choice she had ever made. The systems around her were shifting, watching, closing in. Nothing had broken yet. No voices raised, no scene made. But the quiet carried a warning. This wasn't going to fade away. It was building towards something that would refuse to stay silent. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, tightening in layers, the way systems do when they expect someone to surrender without resistance. Ruth Carter noticed it first in the paperwork. Letters arrived more often, written in heavier language. Deadlines shifted without warning. New requirements appeared only after she had already met the previous ones. Each notice carried the same unspoken message. Her right to remain was being questioned. At the county office, the atmosphere was polite but hollow. Her questions were met with rehearsed explanations and smiles that never reached the eyes. Decisions came down already finalized. The name Harold Whitman appeared again and again, stamped neatly at the bottom of documents that narrowed her options. He didn't need to confront her directly. Authority worked best when it stayed just out of reach. Then the inspections began. Trucks rolled onto the edge of the property without notice. Men walked the land with clipboards circling structures, measuring distances, writing notes. Ruth was never allowed to read. No explanations followed. From across the road, Linda Parker watched through a narrow gap in her curtain, curiosity winning over conscience. She told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. That reasoning spread easily. Silence always finds company. Life outside the property mirrored the same quiet rejection. At church, conversations paused when Ruth approached, then resumed only after she passed. At the bank, her loan request was delayed, then denied without a clear reason. Each space delivered the same message in a different tone. She was alone inside a system designed to wear her down. Still, she refused to sell. She planted. She repaired. She stayed. When Harold Whitman finally appeared in person, his confidence was unmistakable. He stood near the porch, glanced at the soil, and spoke as if the outcome had already been settled. "These violations add up," he said, tapping his clipboard once. The words were clean. The intent was not. Soon after, development signs appeared on neighboring land. Meetings took place that Ruth was never invited to. At the local store, conversations carried one name in lowered voices: Charles Benton. His projects promised growth, opportunity, progress. None of them included the people already there. When he crossed paths with Ruth, he didn't look at her. He spoke past her, as if she were part of the scenery rather than a person standing in the way. The pressure escalated. A formal notice was posted. A date was circled. The land that had sustained Ruth for decades was officially labeled a problem to be removed. When she questioned the decision, the answer came without hesitation. "The law is the law," Harold Whitman said, his confidence settling in. Repetition to him was justification. The morning county vehicles returned. Deputy Mark Reynolds stepped out first. His uniform brought weight to the moment. He avoided Ruth's eyes, focusing instead on procedure, forms, and timing. His presence transformed quiet intimidation into visible threat. Neighbors gathered at a distance, forming a loose line of witnesses who would later claim they saw nothing. Linda Parker stood among them, arms folded, guilt flickering briefly before being buried under habit. Ruth stood firm. Her voice did not shake when she spoke. "I followed every rule you gave me," she said. "It was not a plea. It was a fact." The deputy shifted his stance, lowering his voice as if restraint made the outcome gentler. "I'm just here to carry out the order," Deputy Mark Reynolds replied. Responsibility slid downward, the way systems are designed to function. From the far end of the road, Charles Benton arrived in a vehicle that never touched the dirt. He surveyed the scene calmly, already imagining what would replace what stood there. When someone nearby asked whether there was room for delay, his answer came without pause. "Progress doesn't wait," Charles Benton said. The word sounded generous. The meaning was final. The weight of it all pressed down at once. The land, the authority, the certainty in their movements. Ruth's legs trembled, but she did not step back. This was no longer just about property. It was about who was allowed to remain and who was expected to disappear quietly. What none of them noticed was how carefully the details were being recorded. The timing, the coordination, the confidence with which power was being abused. They assumed silence meant safety. They assumed no one with influence was watching. That assumption was about to become their most expensive mistake. The moment stretched longer than it should have. County vehicles idled at the edge of the field, engines humming like they were waiting for permission to finish what they started. Dust hung low in the air, settling on the ground Ruth Carter had worked for most of her life. Her knees trembled, but she refused to step back. If this was where it ended, it would not end with her lowering her head. Harold Whitman moved first, calm and certain, clipboard tucked under his arm like a badge of authority. He stepped closer, voice steady, already convinced the system would carry him the rest of the way. "We're done discussing this." The words landed with finality, meant to close the door on resistance. Nearby, Deputy Mark Reynolds adjusted his stance, eyes fixed on procedure instead of the woman standing in front of him. He said nothing yet, but his presence made the threat real. Around them, neighbors gathered in loose clusters. Some stared openly, others looked away. Linda Parker stood among them, hands clenched together, watching without crossing the line that separated witness from action. Boxes were lifted. Lines were crossed. What had once been quiet pressure became public humiliation. The land, the house, the life built there, everything was being treated like an inconvenience to be cleared away. Then a new sound broke the rhythm. Not shouting, not sirens, an engine pulling in slowly, deliberately, where no one expected it. Heads turned. The momentum faltered. A man stepped out and surveyed the scene with measured calm. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt. His presence shifted the air before he said a single word. Charles Benton noticed immediately. His jaw tightened as irritation flickered across his face. This was not part of the plan. He stepped forward, voice sharp with entitlement. "This doesn't concern you." The man didn't respond right away. He looked at the documents, the boundary lines, the people watching. Then his eyes settled on Ruth. Recognition moved across his face, quiet but unmistakable. Only halfway through the standoff did the truth begin to surface. The man turned toward the deputy, tone controlled, precise. "Pause this enforcement right now." The command cut through the process like a blade. Deputy Mark Reynolds hesitated. Orders didn't usually move in reverse. Authority wasn't supposed to question itself. But the pause cracked something open, just enough to let everything underneath start to unravel. Documents appeared, clean, organized, undeniable. Timelines didn't match. Inspection dates overlapped. Days' offices were closed. Zoning approvals referenced meetings that had never taken place. Each detail was small on its own. Together, they formed a picture no one could ignore. Harold Whitman leaned forward, trying to regain control, but the confidence he had relied on began to drain from his face. His breathing changed. His certainty thinned. The system he trusted was no longer protecting him. It was exposing him. Names were mentioned that carried weight. Oversight bodies, independent reviews, immediate audits. The language shifted from assumption to consequence. Charles Benton stepped back instinctively, scanning the crowd, realizing this moment had escaped his control. Ruth watched it unfold, disbelief mixing with something heavier. Validation. The fight she had been forced to carry alone was no longer hers alone. The deputy cleared his throat, voice noticeably different now. "We're suspending enforcement until further notice." The sentence hit like a release. Engines powered down. Hands stopped moving. Phones finally came out. Whispers spread through the crowd as reality settled in. In the background, William Thompson's name surfaced quietly in old filings and financial trails, the foundation that explained how a boy once dismissed as nothing had become impossible to push aside. The man finally turned back to Ruth. He met her eyes, steady and sincere. "I didn't forget." The words carried 20 years of silence, memory, and restraint. The land was still there. The people were still watching. But the balance had shifted for good. What began as removal had become exposure, and what was meant to end quietly now stood fully revealed. This was no longer about survival. It was about consequence. The fallout did not move slowly, and it did not stay quiet. Once the enforcement was suspended, the machinery that had protected abuse turned inward. Investigations were launched immediately. Files were reopened. Timelines were examined without courtesy or patience. Harold Whitman's authority collapsed under scrutiny. His decisions, once treated as routine, were reclassified as misconduct. Within weeks, he was removed from his position, his name no longer shielded by titles or procedure. There was no quiet transfer, no graceful exit, only consequences that could not be reversed. The projects tied to Charles Benton followed soon after. Development plans were frozen. Contracts were paused. Oversight bodies moved in where influence had once kept them out. The image of progress he had sold for years cracked under exposure. Growth built on removal and silence was no longer marketable once the truth stood in daylight. For Ruth Carter, the change was not about celebration. It was about dignity restored. The land remained hers, not as a favor, not as charity, but as a right that should never have been questioned. Protections were formalized. Boundaries were secured. For the first time in years, she worked her soil without waiting for footsteps or engines. She was no longer standing alone against a system. She was standing on record, validated. The community shifted in quieter ways. Neighbors who once watched from a distance avoided eye contact at first. Some apologized without words. Others said nothing at all. Linda Parker learned that silence carries weight long after the moment passes. Looking away had felt safe at the time. It did not feel harmless anymore. Deputy Mark Reynolds returned to routine work, but the memory of that day followed him. Procedure had protected him once. It no longer felt neutral. He understood now how easily order becomes a shield for injustice. Elijah Thompson did not stay long after the dust settled. He walked the land with Ruth one last time, listening more than speaking. What mattered wasn't the power he held. It was how it had been used. The promise made years ago had never been about money. It was about refusing to forget. In the background, William Thompson's choices made decades earlier finally revealed their full impact. Access, education, resources, threads that turned survival into leverage, not to dominate, but to correct. This story did not end gently. It ended honestly. Because racism rarely announces itself with shouting. It hides in paperwork, policies, and silence. And justice doesn't arrive because it's deserved. It arrives when someone refuses to let the truth disappear. The question isn't whether this happens. The question is how often it happens quietly and who will choose not to look away next. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, comment, and subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen.